They were like family, building America's most famous hot sauce together for 28 years. But a hidden betrayal would unravel their bond, leading to a multi-million-dollar fraud verdict and ultimately leaving an entire empire scrambling for answers. David Tran uttered those words in court, about the farmer he was suing, a man with whom he had forged America's most famous hot sauce empire over nearly 3 decades, beginning with just a handwritten letter and a handshake. Now these two men sat on opposite sides of a courtroom. The jury not only sided with the farmer Craig Underwood, but it also found Tran's company, Huy Fong, guilty of fraud, ordering them to pay $23.3 million. The man who had never spent a single dollar on advertising, who had built an entire empire on word of mouth and a promise, had been publicly branded a liar. So what led to such a devastating loss, and who ultimately paid the price? This tale of betrayal is built upon a foundation of trust, a story that began long before Tran ever set foot in Los Angeles. Before emigrating, Tran operated a small family hot sauce business in Vietnam, crafting pepper sauces like pepper sauté. He bottled them in recycled baby food jars and sold them locally. Born in Soc Trang, he was a Chinese-Vietnamese refugee, fleeing post-war persecution of ethnic Chinese. Hot sauce was his family's trade, scaled to whatever glass jars he could acquire. In 1978, Tran boarded a Taiwanese freighter named the Huy Fong, alongside approximately 3,000 other refugees, eventually receiving asylum in the United States. He would later name his company after this very vessel, a choice that underscores the profound connection between his identity and that perilous escape. A single phone call determined his destination. He inquired with his brother-in-law if Los Angeles had red peppers. Upon receiving an affirmative answer, he moved west. For most entrepreneurs, a business location is a strategic calculation involving markets and rent. For Tran, however, it boiled down to a singular product: whether he could cultivate the peppers needed in his new home. By February 1980, Tran was producing chili sauce in California, bottling it primarily for the Asian community. The company began modestly in a 465-square-meter facility on Spring Street in LA's Chinatown. For decades, it remained privately owned and family-run, operating without outside investors and with minimal advertising. Tran often stated he couldn't afford traditional advertising, so he relied on his customers to spread the word. He also never intended to sell the company, explaining that he pursued it simply because he enjoyed the work. His dream, as he told the LA Times, was never to become a billionaire. He founded the company, he said, because he and his family loved fresh, spicy chili sauce. This unwavering independence, his consistent refusal of investors and external advice, is a crucial detail as it profoundly influenced almost every subsequent decision, including the one that ultimately shattered a friendship. A singular challenge, however, stood between Tran and the potential for unlimited growth. He required far more peppers than he could readily source. Then, in 1988, a letter arrived. Craig Underwood, a farmer from Ventura County, wrote to Tran, inquiring if he would be interested in having him grow peppers. The subsequent agreement was precisely the kind that would later make legal professionals uneasy. It was a blend of oral understandings, limited written terms, and practices established through years of collaboration. The arrangement thrived on prepayment and mutual trust, rather than meticulously detailed contracts outlining contingencies should either party withdraw. Tran encapsulated the agreement with remarkable simplicity. You grow it, I'll sell it. This business relationship quickly blossomed into a genuine friendship. The two men introduced their families, witnessed their children mature, and even discussed the succession of their businesses to the next generation. Their bond deepened to the extent that Underwood attended the weddings of Tran's children. This was clearly far more than just two companies bound by a contract. These two men's lives had become intricately intertwined. This deep partnership also laid the foundation for an empire. Underwood dedicated his farm almost entirely to Huy Fong, expanding his operations from approximately 162 hectares to around 1,214 hectares to meet the escalating demand. In his final seasons, he cultivated an astonishing 45.36 million kilograms of jalapenos across 688 hectares, selling them at a rate of $13,000 per hectare. This dependence, crucially, was mutual. Underwood became virtually the sole supplier of red jalapenos for Huy Fong, while Huy Fong, in turn, became essentially his only buyer. Each man's business had effectively become a single point of failure for the other. The results were undeniable. Sriracha became the third most popular hot sauce in America, trailing only Tabasco and Frank's Red Hot. By 2020, Huy Fong's sales reached $131 million, all achieved without a single dollar spent on advertising. By 2019, the company was generating approximately $150 million annually, holding roughly a 10% share of the $1.55 billion U.S. hot sauce market. To manage this immense volume, Huy Fong inaugurated a massive 60,850 square meter factory in Irwindale in 2010, consolidating production from its older Rosemead plant. This new facility stood as a testament to the sheer scale that their handshake agreement had achieved, a refugee's recipe now flowing through a complex the size of a small town's worth of warehouses. However, that gleaming new factory, a symbol of their remarkable journey, was about to become a source of misery for Tran's neighbors. Success, it turned out, had a distinct odor. In October 2013, the city of Irwindale filed a lawsuit against Huy Fong, alleging that chili odors emanating from the new plant caused residents burning eyes, irritated throats, and headaches. Resident Rita Sanchez described the burning sensation on production days as unbearable. The complaint detailed odors so potent that residents were forced to move activities indoors and, in some cases, even evacuate their homes. One woman recounted a bridal shower at her house where guests had to retreat inside, choking and hacking from the fumes. Certainly not an ideal party atmosphere. Yet the case presented a complication. Not everyone could actually detect the smell. Air quality regulators reported no harmful violations, and a visiting food writer noted no odor outside the plant, experiencing irritation only deep within the grinding room itself. Supporters of the factory highlighted that the majority of formal complaints originated from just 4 households, suggesting a community more divided than the lawsuit initially portrayed. In November 2013, Judge Robert O'Brien issued an injunction, deeming the odor extremely annoying, irritating, and offensive to the senses, while also acknowledging a lack of credible evidence that it had damaged anyone's health. Tran, for his part, publicly stated his desire to be a good neighbor and his willingness to collaborate with the city to mitigate the smell. He also made it clear that he felt cornered. To underscore his position, he invited officials from other cities to tour the factory, challenging them to see if their own residents would complain, a move that showcased both his confidence and political acumen. Crucially, Craig Underwood himself testified on Tran's behalf at a city council meeting. The dispute was finally resolved in 2014 after Huy Fong implemented mitigation measures, leading the city to drop both its nuisance declaration and its lawsuit. Tran had weathered the storm with his neighbors, and the farmer had stood by him throughout. But unbeknownst to Underwood, behind the scenes, Tran was already meticulously planning to sever ties with the very man who had just defended him. This was no sudden betrayal, at least not from Tran's perspective. It unfolded quietly over many years, a deliberate strategy that a jury would later find impossible to interpret as an accident. Around 2014, even as Underwood continued to expand his operations, Tran discreetly established a company called Chili Co., specifically to source peppers from other farmers. Court evidence subsequently revealed that Tran had been planning to sever ties as early as 2014, all while repeatedly assuring Underwood that their long-standing arrangement would remain unchanged. Promises and deception were simultaneously running on parallel tracks. Underwood, however, only heard the assurances, and so he continued to invest heavily. Relying solely on Tran's word, Underwood leased additional land, hired more workers, and purchased new equipment for a crop he firmly believed was already sold. His business was 80% dependent on Huy Fong. Every commitment he made hinged entirely on their handshake agreement enduring. In 2016, Tran, who had previously shown no interest in harvest operations, controversially flew a drone over Underwood's fields during harvest. After severing their relationship, he then used this very footage to instruct other farmers on efficient harvesting techniques. Underwood's decades of accumulated expertise, the practical craft of harvesting jalapenos at scale, was thus silently transferred to the very growers who would replace him. The plan was almost complete, and Underwood remained entirely oblivious. In late 2016, Tran finally terminated the relationship. Underwood was left with a planted crop, and suddenly, no buyer. Approximately 80% of his business evaporated, forcing the farm to lay off about half its workforce, around 45 individuals. Then, Tran escalated the breakup into a legal battle by suing first. In 2017, Huy Fong sued Underwood, demanding the return of approximately $1.45 million it claimed it had overpaid. Underwood countersued for more than $20 million, arguing that Huy Fong's actions had effectively destroyed a farm meticulously built around its specific needs. The handshake agreement was now destined for a jury, with both men's reputations hanging in the balance. On the first day of trial in June 2019, Tran took the stand. He testified that they were like family, that he deeply trusted Underwood, and that he never anticipated such an outcome. It was a poignant sentiment, coming from the man who had spent years orchestrating this very ending. Yet, the jury remained unconvinced. It found that Huy Fong had breached its contract and committed fraud, awarding Underwood $23.3 million, a sum that included $10 million in punitive damages. A California appeals court later unanimously upheld the verdict, citing ample evidence of fraud through concealment and misrepresentation. For Underwood, the victory, while real, felt hollow. He stated that the experience left him believing Tran had genuinely sought to destroy him. Nevertheless, he rebuilt. Underwood launched his own Sriracha, named Dragon Sriracha, utilizing the very same peppers he had cultivated for Huy Fong for 28 years. The farmer who had dedicated 3 decades to making someone else's product famous now had his own brand on the market. Huy Fong, however, had lost its stable, dedicated California supplier and was about to learn precisely the true value of that partnership. With Underwood gone, the company was forced to source peppers from smaller, less equipped growers scattered across California, New Mexico, and Mexico. This new arrangement left Huy Fong far more vulnerable to adverse weather conditions and crop failures than it had ever been under their previous long-standing agreement. That vulnerability quickly manifested. Severed from Underwood's supply, Huy Fong halted Sriracha production in 2022, publicly attributing the stoppage to weather issues and a chili shortage. Bottles that once retailed for between $5 and $10 began reselling for $20 to $150 each on platforms like Amazon and eBay. At one point, a single small bottle was listed for $40, with a 4-pack of larger bottles commanding $200, and these production pauses continued. The scarcity impacted ordinary consumers in ways that would be amusing if they weren't so genuine. One fan described herself as a Sriracha hoarder, while another admitted to cutting her usage by more than half. One restaurant witnessed its supply plummet from 300 bottles to just 100, as desperate diners resorted to stealing them. Fans were now paying exorbitant ransom prices for a sauce that was once a common household staple, and Tran placed the blame squarely on the weather. The man he had abandoned, however, offered reporters a very different narrative. Underwood asserted that if their partnership had remained intact, there would have been an ample supply of Sriracha. He had consistently maintained that he could have met demand, even through droughts, had the relationship simply endured. The empty shelves, he insisted, were not the weather's fault. Tran called Underwood family, yet he spent years meticulously planning to sever ties with him, a deception a jury ultimately branded as fraud. Today, the empire that discarded its farmer blames the weather for its empty shelves. Meanwhile, the friend it left behind now possesses all the peppers he needs, and his own bottle of Dragon Sriracha sits proudly on the shelf, right next to the rooster.